Hey guys, it's John Chihak of Anti-Hero Brand Press and AHB Kids. I'm here with a top 5 list. This time I'm doing my top 5 favorite directors, and surprisingly only one of them is an American director. And I say surprising because I've actually had conversations with people who, when I've told them that I dug a certain movie, they just looked at me cross-eyed because somebody with tattoos, piercings, and who works out can't like cinematic movies, can't like international movies, can't like well-made movies. I guess I'm the kind of guy who looks like he owns pit bulls and only like Schwarzenegger flicks. And don't get me wrong, I appreciate a Schwarzenegger flick, but it's usually not a solidly made movie unless it's Terminator or Terminator 2. Pretty much everything else he's done has been just cannon fodder for Saturday afternoon action fest. Honorable mentions on this list are going to be Kevin Smith. He's kind of the everyman who showed that we can all be creative in some way, shape, or form and get our thoughts and our stories and our ideas out there. So it's a big nod to him. He used to be number 5 on my list, but the number 5 person on my list has garnered quite a bit of controversy in the last several years, especially with some of the flicks he's made, even to the point of people starting an online petition to get him cast off a future project that he was making that has since come out and has his name on the director's slot. Tobe Hooper is another favorite of mine. He made the favorite movie in my heart, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Poltergeist and Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. He's just a really phenomenal director and thinker, thought processor. John Carpenter is also on that list. Halloween, The Thing, and of course some of the cult favorites like They Live are just great representations of filmmaking where you don't need to go super over the top and it doesn't have to be cinematic in scope to tell a really, really good story. He puts a lot of undertones in his movies, a lot of thought process going into them, whether it be about, xenophobia and fears in The Thing, or like, the just irrational fear of the boogeyman in Halloween, or the idea of capitalism and consumerism and just this entropy of just, be a sheep and obey in They Live. But onto my list, I'm going from 5 to 1 because number 5 on this list is the one who's drawing the most controversy, even though I'd like to leave him for last to just spark debate. I'm going to lead off with him. Number 5 on my list is Zack Snyder, director of Justice League, Sucker Punch, 300, Watchmen, the remake of Dawn of the Dead. He's done a lot of movies, and I have enjoyed every single one of his movies. I'm not sure why people seem to loathe him so much, considering, he's making predominantly comic book movies, but maybe that's why people have such a problem with him, is that he doesn't tend to make original concepts. I mean, the Justice League, Superman, and Batman have been around for, 75 years, at least 80 years for Superman. 300 he remade from Frank Miller's tale about the Spartans. Watchmen from Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' legendary book that's taught at colleges and released in 1986. So maybe that's why people have a gripe against him. He's not making anything original. However, his movies are visually stunning. If you can't agree that he's a good filmmaker, you can at least see that he makes a wide scope. He thinks in anamorphic widescreen, like he just sees it that way. And it takes a different kind of creative mind and a different director to think that big in scope. And I'll give you a movie that didn't exist in another media beforehand, but probably should be a comic book or some sort of an anime in the future, in Sucker Punch. That movie touches a near and dear point to me personally, which I'll get into in another video. But it would just be a really long story and I tend to babble. Number 4 on my list is Luc Besson. He directed probably my second favorite movie of all time in Leon. You may not be familiar with that movie. Its American release was called The Professional, and now is released as Leon the Professional. And you never got to see the international release unless you waited for the DVD, which was about 10 years later, or if you went to a place like Casa Video here in Tucson that has a lot of international movies and cult movies. The international release has an additional 20 to 25 minutes worth of footage, which is now considered a director's cut, and explains the relationship between the hero and the heroine in Jean Reno and Natalie Portman. There was a lot of controversy that year because I remember that was also the year Interview with a Vampire came out. And Kirsten Dunst's character, even though she was an immortal as a vampire, still appeared to be a young girl, a very, very, very young teenager, who was, at one point laid in a casket with Brad Pitt, who was figuratively an adult, because he was in an adult form. And so Natalie Portman's role as Matilda in Leon garnered a lot of controversy because, in other countries, people think differently and do different things. And so by cutting that 25 minutes out to satisfy American audiences, they really did them a disservice, because there's one scene in particular where you're not sure what the hell happened and you think there was a liaison between Matilda and Leon, and there really wasn't, because they explained that in the footage that had to be taken out for audiences, because sometimes when you hit people with the ultimate, like, this is how the story goes, they don't want to accept it anyways. So that's one of those weird things. He also did Fifth Element, La Femme Nikita, which they remade in America, called Point of No Return, with Bridget Fonda. Now, interesting thing about La Femme Nikita is Jean Reno, who plays Leon in The Professional, played the cleaner who comes in to clean up Nikita's mess in one of her botched hit jobs. And it was a very, very small role. It was maybe 5 minutes or so on screen. But Besson was so taken with how Jean Reno played that part that he gave him his own movie. Now, Fifth Element was supposed to film, but because of scheduling conflicts, probably with Bruce Willis, they had to put Fifth Element on hold. And so in turn, he took that time and made Leon, which is actually, story-wise, a superior film to The Fifth Element. He also made The Messenger, the story of Joan of Arc, with Mila Jovovich, who was also in Fifth Element. So he kind of sticks with certain actors and actresses together. A lot of directors do. And number 3 on my list is definitely no different. Guillermo del Toro, master of the quasi-horror movie. And I say quasi-horror movie because what he does is not what you would consider traditional American horror. Now, del Toro, just like Snyder, can think very, very big in cinematic scope. I mean, he did Pacific Rim, and it was definitely different than Pan's Labyrinth or The Devil's Backbone or Kronos or even The Shape of Water. So he's able to create these great characters, these great monsters. And he's done a couple of comic book movies too. He did Blade 2, he did Hellboy 2, The Golden Army, and added to that. Now, for Del Toro, actors that he works with on a repeated basis, one is Doug Jones, who's played most of the creatures in his movies. And then Ron Perlman, and Doug Jones and Ron Perlman worked together in Hellboy 2, which was pretty cool as well. Shape of Water, I actually saw that on Christmas Day with my cousin Jackie, and I haven't been to a movie on Christmas Day since The Spirit in 2008. So it was 9 years later, and Shape of Water completely blew the Spirit experience out of the water, so to say. He tells a really good story. I think there were elements of Shape of Water that some people didn't feel pan out all the way, but it was beautiful, and it was a different kind of love story. Del Toro just has a way of communicating with audiences that I don't think a lot of directors do or even attempt. It's a much more intimate level um, of communication. Now, my number two pick could flip with my number one pick at any given day, any given time, depending on whose movies I've seen most recently. And that is, at least for today on this video, is Akira Kurosawa, the director of Seven Samurai and Rashomon, and Yojimbo, and countless other movies. And he wasn't limited to just Japanese dynasty samurai movies. He worked again, another director who worked with an actor repeatedly in Toshiro Mifune, and his work was so brilliant. And back in the 40s and 50s, was so cinematic in scope. Almost nobody was directing movies like that. And here's a little lead-in for you. People say that, like, okay, Tarantino ripped off John Woo with his, shoot 'em up face-off scenes. Well, John Woo ripped off spaghetti westerns from the 60s and 70s, but those guys ripped off the master, the guy who started all that, in Akira Kurosawa. I mean, Seven Samurai is what became of the Magnificent Seven, or it was the precursor to the Magnificent Seven. Which there was also a remake of that called Desperado. And then, of course, the most modern remake, which was part action, part comedy, in the Magnificent Seven again. So these are stories that have been told and told and told and told, but the guy who started it is Kurosawa, and he's phenomenal. Also, if you have Netflix, I highly recommend watching the documentary Mifune. It's almost totally in Japanese, so if you're not into reading subtitles, you might want to pass. However, it's a great tribute to an actor who was just legendary in what he did. And this was a guy who didn't just do like action, like swords play type stuff. This was a guy who could act. Like, you could feel him emoting in the movies. It was just phenomenal. Especially because, I don't speak Japanese. And so I'm reading the subtitles and I'm watching the movie, and you can still feel it. It was just great on so many levels. And the number one on my list, and again, can switch with Kurosawa depending on whose movies I've seen most often or most recently, Hayao Miyazaki, the godfather of animation. I say this to people, and it's actually something he does not like the comparison to, but he is the Japanese Walt Disney, except better. He doesn't do movies that do the prototypical princess, the prototypical female coming-of-age story where she needs to be rescued by a man, or, who turns out to be a complete stranger, which is kind of strange in and of itself. He doesn't spin a lot of old storytelling, or like Grimm Brothers or Hans Christian Andersen or anything like that. The one he did that with was Ponyo, which was still a really phenomenal movie. And it's a toss-up for me as to which movie is my favorite that he's done, because each of them is phenomenal, and I own every single one of the features that he's ever done, from Lupin III, Castle of Cagliostro, all the way to the final movie that he's done, which I can't remember which one it was, if it was Ponyo or Castle in the Sky. Or Wind Rises, I think, was the last one that he did. But I've upgraded all of his movies to Blu-ray, except for Lupin III, because they don't make it on Blu-ray yet. But he tells such vivid stories, and I got to see Kiki's Delivery Service like 2 months ago at the Loft here in Tucson, and was a great experience. I don't think I've ever seen a Miyazaki movie on the big screen before that day, and it was just great to watch. He's influenced so many storytellers and so many animators over the years that it's unfair to compare him to Disney, other than the influence that he's created. And if you really think about it, Disney has changed a lot of their filmmaking ways because Pixar picked up on the phenomenal storytelling of Miyazaki and started telling these great stories. So Disney, who owns Pixar is like, well, we have to set everything up and we have to tell better stories. So that's my top 5 list. I'd love to hear your top 5 lists of favorite directors, or, if you'd like to discuss some of my picks on here. I'm sure Zack Snyder would probably be a topic of debate for some people, but I stick by my choices, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on them. Again, this is John Chihak of Anti-Hero Brand Press and AHB Kids. You can support me on Patreon. I need to start posting there more at patreon.com/antiherobrand, or for my all ages one, patreon.com/AHB Kids with a Z. I'll see you later. Bye.